So Bailly tells us as an example of one of the rapist murders from Juarez, when a man who was caught ended up fitting not the profile that was usually expected. He was a construction worker, right, who drank too much and consumed a lot of drugs, and he lost his senses. So Bailly gave us this as an example to think with, in which there are all of these kind of narratives constructed of how and why and by whom these murders took place, and also were able to have surrounding impunity. And she gives us this example in which we see a person who committed this murder in a way and for reasons that don't fit the kind of usual narrative, right? And I was thinking that actually a variety of factors could have begun the impunity surrounding these kinds of murders. And I imagine that at least some of the killers at the beginning had ties to people powerful enough to intimidate the police, right, and the local law enforcement. And it seems to me that once the precedent was set, the kind of state of exception then could become the rule, right? And anyone could participate in these murders for any reason. And that's the way that I usually have thought about these cases. But the questions that Cecilia opens up are not necessarily counter to these, but they're in a different kind of arena, right? She's drawing attention to these murders as a way of men from various class backgrounds to assert masculinity at a time which traditional means of asserting masculinity might not be possible to everyone, right? And this is actually really useful, especially in terms of how, toward the end of the talk, you talked about how the focus has been on feminicides, which is still a very important focus, and thinking about them as gender-based crimes in that way, but really thinking about them as gender-based crimes in terms of what the participants are getting out of it too, right? What the stakes of masculinity are in understanding these crimes, and how the perpetrators are getting masculinity, and how other men are also getting masculinity out of these very public, spectacular crimes, right? So I wanted to also keep, and this is really valuable and I think a really useful way to think about this, Cecilia. And I want us to also keep in mind kind of scholars of masculinity, the way that they talk about masculinity as not being one thing that's fixed, but something that there are multiples of and that can change through time. And maybe we can in some ways contemplate on this panel too, and with the audience, some of the ways that, like, in any given context, you can have a certain hegemonic masculinity, but then also other kinds of subordinate masculinities too, right? And the content of these categories can change through time, and sometimes the kind of more subordinate masculinities can actually overtake or change the hegemonic masculinities too. And I also wanted to think a little bit about Bailly's insights about militarization and how that kind of added to this situation of masculine violence in Juarez. And in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, where I did my research in 2008 to 2009, I found that there, like many others have noted, violence and terror was increased after militarization, right? And there were many cases of complaints against the military when I was there, and people protested the military presence, of course, too. But the sex workers, as well as other poor women in the city, tended to believe that it was actually people associated with the cartels that were dressed as the military, abusing them, as well as that they were the ones who were organizing the protests against the military too. So and that's kind of linked to some of what you were talking about in terms of not always knowing, like, who's behind these masks, right? And you see these kinds of, this evidence of this certain kind of masculine performance, right? But then not even, and knowing that it has something to do with power and territory and sovereignty, right? but then not always, even for the local populations, people don't always know what it is a symbol of, right? So I wanted to think kind of about the relationship between the different kinds of forms of masculinity in some of these various institutions, including the military on both the US side and the Mexican side, and also thinking about how, like for example, where I did my research, people were usually being terrorized by the Zetas, which of course were trained not only by the Mexican military, but also by the US through the School of Americas, at least some of the founding members. So I think thinking about kind of all these different kinds, to what extent we have overlaps in these forms of masculinities, and in what cases we can see maybe counter masculinities to the hegemonic. But thank you so much again, Dr. Bayit, for your lecture.
Good afternoon. I'm Maria Gonzalez. I'm in the Department of English, and I want to thank Dr. Bailly for explaining to us that we're always looking for, in many ways, we're desperate for a simple answer. And one of the challenges that we're facing here is our attempts at coherency continues and always seems to fail. We're not going to get a coherent answer. It's chaotic, and part of that chaos, I can point, as you point to a lot of things. Radical capitalism won. I'm reminded of how I grew up in El Paso and left the city in 1979, and has since then have come back and visited, and how the fall of the Berlin Wall, radical capitalism winning, how different the US-Mexico border was, and how a saturation of complete capitalist response, together with the militarization of the border. I remember when the border was not an overt military zone. It was a bunch of guys, a bunch of customs guys who you'd wave to, you'd say American, and you'd get back in. That doesn't happen anymore. The militarization, along with the capitalization and the complete critique of something opposite, is clearly part of the driving force that you're describing here, Dr. Baella. And our attempts to try to make sense out of it, out of a situation where incoherency and crisis allows for, in some ways, efficiency of economy, allows for actions that are totally immoral to occur and be rationalized. I worry a little bit, I worry a lot about the continued militarization of our society. Please, this campus, next year, the gun is going to be allowed on this campus, and we're all going to die. The violence is going to escalate, not de-escalate. The introduction of more militarization into a space escalates violence. Masculinity, but also femininity, are definitions that we are always negotiating. But in many ways, militarization and capitalization solidify roles. And the calcification of gendered identities is one of the products of militarization. I'm not saying that we should, actually I am saying, from now on, there should be a moratorium on any males joining the military or police. Nothing but females, including transgender females. Everyone else can't join them. Just a, experiment. Let's see what happens. One of the sad things and probably the saddest thing, is that everyone on the border is becoming a victim, including those who think they are in power. They find themselves forced to act in certain ways, out of protection of their families, out of protection of their goods, out of protection. And when you take away options and solidify options, in other words, if your only option now is to cross spaces while armed, well, something's going to happen. And this hypermasculinity that says, if you mess with my masculinity, I have a right to challenge that. One of the explanations recently I've come across for masculinity being an identity is masculinity is violence. Masculinity constructs violence, then it destroys things, but and destroys masculinity in the process, and hence has to recover masculinity by destroying masculinity, and then recover again. So it's this vicious cycle of, Montes is a really fascinating narrative. His masculinity was rebuffed by another male. So there's that first deconstruction, destruction of masculinity. He then, in order, in some way, to recover his masculinity, murders a female, rapes and murders a female, to reconstruct his masculinity. Well, here comes the state that's now going to destroy his masculinity by reconstructing, by imposing its power. So it's just this endless cycle. And I was really almost touched by the men saying, he lost it. He did. He lost his masculinity. Pardon him. Give him back his masculinity. And yet, forgiveness isn't necessarily a masculine trait. Am I correct? Revenge is. And that's part of the sad part, is that the calcification of masculine traits become violent traits as opposed to mercy and gentleness and looking for other ways to help a society. Dr. Baye asked very fascinating questions. Our border is a space, is becoming more and more a space of violence and trauma. Our politicians are demanding more militarization. No one's calling for flowers on the borders. I recommend we should be the ones who say, why don't we hand people teddy bears or maybe gummy bears? Something other than more weapons? The most frightening implication of your work, Dr. Baya, is, as the violence continues, is that we're now caught in a cycle of more violence and then more violence. And our work as scholars, and hopefully activists as well, is to ask to get out of that pattern, to in fact try to find other ways to respond to murder and mayhem. And what are those other ways? That's the real challenge. Do we have to enter, the cycle that's going to be there? We capture individuals who've been destructive, murdered women, and now we're going to murder them. Are there other options? Thank you, Dr. Baya.
My name is Christina Sisk. I'm in the Department of Hispanic Studies. And first of all, I want to thank Cecilia for the great talk. And I'd like to also thank Sarah and Maria for participating in this panel. I've been really waiting for it, excited for the dialogue. And I will tell you why. My students already know this. I've been thinking a lot about crime and trying to undo the logic of just a simple question of morality. And I think it's important, an important discussion to have, because it has a lot of implications. We're not just talking about Ciudad Juarez when we're making this discussion. We're thinking about migrants and how it affects the US, right? And the way that we generate this discussion on criminality has a direct implication on how the discussion of immigration is posited and how it plays out in the media, right? And I think in a simplistic sort of fashion, what it does is it plays to this fear of Mexican masculinity in a very similar way that it plays out to a fear of Black masculinity, right? And the implication or the supposed threat to white women especially, right? Needless to say, some of these discussions, or most of these discussions lately, have centered around Donald Trump, very obviously, and I've had these discussions. My students can tell you, they'll shake their heads and say, yeah, she talks about Donald Trump all the time. But thinking about how we think about crime, social crimes, I think what Cecilia's presentation offers us is another solution that's not a simple moralistic solution, right? The wrong versus right? Or let's say evil, right, versus good, which tends to be reduced to Christian terms, right? Very much so. What it points to is perhaps a larger crime of humanity, right? Which is violence against people, the violence of poverty itself, the violence of borders themselves, right? And dividing people. The violence that we see because of the movement that people have to go through with these different spaces, as you mentioned, right? They're not, we can talk about the role of both internal migration, right? Internal in terms of people migrating to Ciudad Juarez, as well as international migration, right? But thinking about it in a way that doesn't play to the fears of right-wing politics in this country, right? And also that this is part of the frustration, thinking about the role of the US in all of these processes, right? Because if you start thinking about the larger picture, you can point to the role of capitalism, the role of the maquiladoras in the area, the distinct pressure there is in all that. I mean, and you could probably go into that dynamic much better or much more eloquently than I can at the moment, but I was also interested in your way of avoiding the use of saying cartels, right? Drug organization, because that also, thinking about drug cartels or thinking about the drug business, there's also a moral weight put on that, right? That's done because of legal transactions, right? And we don't put that same weight of morality, perhaps that we should, on legal drugs and what that entails, right? So we have a very fine line on what is morally right and wrong, right? But in the end, we don't really think of the crimes of humanity, right? What happens and where they really come from. I mean, it's kind of like, I keep going to the Milgram experiments, right? Where they everybody could sort of, since they didn't have full responsibility for what had happened, it happened, right? So it's like, somebody told me to do this, I enact and pose some violence on somebody else, right? But in the end, we want to find a fault or a culpability in one, but it's systemic, right? And it's not just one person. And I think that's where people are looking for just the culprits, right? And trying to avoid the larger questions that should be really framed, right? And in the end, those are the same questions that we come with migration, because people don't necessarily leave because they want. There is a culture of migration, but I mean, at the moment, the people who are coming aren't necessarily Mexican, they're Central American, which points to the same type of problems, right, that you were discussing in terms of the violence and how it's discussed and how it generates. It's like the cycle of violence starts to a point where it doesn't end, and where you can see the beginning of it, but it never generates an end, per se, right? And we say, where does it end? And we don't really know exactly where that point is. So I don't know. Those are sort of some ideas that I had. I think some of your work that you presented today is comparable to Ilana Zilberg's work on El Salvador, on La Mara Salvatrucha. But I think it's important that we posit this in a US perspective to really make us think about that hyper-masculinity. It's not that it's not there, right? But because there's a lot of people who would prefer to, at least from the US side, to negate that it exists, right? And I think we need to have that discussion. And so I think it's not just an issue of Ciudad Juarez, right? So thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk.
Just a couple quick things, because probably those of you in the audience have thoughts now based on all these stimulating points. I was taking notes all over my presentation. Really, really great stuff. I appreciate the engagement. And just to underscore a few things, I thought Dr. Luna's intervention was critical about we should be talking about masculinities, plural. Mm-hmm. And what I was discussing here was hegemonic masculinity, and it's one form of hegemonic masculinity. And I think you can see even from that exchange that I described that we had with a man in the neighborhood that there's actually these kind of competing or just coexisting kind of models that people appeal to simultaneously, right? The point about chaos and radical capitalism, and your response was filled with so many things that made me think and made me relate to the work I do. But I do think something I didn't mention in giving my talk is that part of the argument for me is that when you have these spaces where there's no total control of, that what you have, when you have these power vacuums or that seem like power vacuums, what emerges in that space is a more authoritarian form of power, right? And so there's this question of why on the border on both sides we have the presence of more police than anywhere else, local, state, federal, on the Mexican side, on the US side, and army, right? And somehow it's the region that people describe as being no man's land that's out of control. And so those spaces, I don't think they're necessarily power vacuums, right? It's just these spaces where more authoritarian forms emerge as a response, and one response is nationalism. And I think the U.S.-Mexico border fence and the conversations we're having about immigration, which Dr. Sisk mentioned, are these kinds of more authoritarian responses in response to a fear that the nation state doesn't have the kind of authority it had before, our country's changing because of these economic forces. And also it's a fear of cultural change, of racial and ethnic change, right? It was interesting for me to hear, in terms of chaos, a journalist from Guatemala who reached out to me on Facebook and was saying, I was interested in the border as an Associated Press reporter, but it just seemed like no man's land there. And then I said, so what have you worked on? And he said, well, I covered the civil wars in Central America. And I said, how is that easier? And he's like, the civil wars, yeah, I could do that, but the border is just this other thing. It just seems like it can come from anywhere. And I said, I guess with the civil wars, you knew who the parties were and you could talk to them. You could literally go up. And he said, yes, exactly. So this idea of kind of advanced hyper-capitalism, radical capitalism, and the chaos and then the militaristic response, the incoherence, exactly. Really important point about drug cartels and not sort of distinguishing them as being outside of anything, really. And I was emphasizing sort of not calling them cartels also because just the model is shifting and there are these shifting groups. Mm-hmm. Really good book by Moises Naim called Illicit describes the underground economies that necessarily emerge along with the infrastructure that we build for legal global economies to flourish. Mm-hmm. It necessarily kind of also gives rise to these underground economies. And he talks about how one of the things that's changing is that it becomes more economically and advantageous to kind of work with various groups and shift more. That old model of one group, one boss. I think in Mexico, we talk about how the government took out the capos, the major capos, and created, what's the expression all the DA guys use? Like, you hit the beehive, whatever that, I always get my English idioms wrong. And sayings wrong. I think that's part of it, and I also think just the model's changing. I think within groups, it becomes more advantageous to shift. So they're more like these units that we can't pin down, and even trying to name them and give them one identity is a little bit misleading. And finally, just on the comment of we should be giving out gummy bears or flowers, well, first, before I say that, I just wanted to also point out that in the U.S., as I mentioned, with the border fence and the patrolling of the border, we see the structural violence, but I think now we're actually seeing the hypermasculinity and we're confronting the physical violence in the form of, with these conversations we're having about police force. But finally, with the gummy bears and the flowers, the president of the University of Texas at Brownsville, which is one of the entities that owns land that is situated on the border, along the borderline, was one of the entities that was sued by the federal government so they could build a border fence on the property of the university. And they did build it, although it was an unusual case where they got the university fought in court and a federal judge ruled that the government had to negotiate. And so what resulted was like a baseball park style fence that the university argued, well, this is a physical impediment or whatever kind of terminology, specialized terminology the government uses. But then they had a ceremony that the president organized without letting the government know, and they planted these flowers and these vines that go through the fence, through the baseball park fence. And DHS, Department of Homeland Security, was very upset. And after that, they no longer negotiated with the university. But so yeah, someone did think of how do we plant flowers in the place of this violence.
Yeah, okay. We can open up to the audience if anyone has questions or comments. We're live streaming, so that's why it's really important that we use these microphones.
Hi, thank you for those comments and for your presentation. I was wondering what the more subversive forms of new masculinity are that you found too, the ones that didn't make it into this kind of hyper-violent model. What are some that can revamp the way we think about machismo or even paternalism? And I guess alongside that, I'd like your take on a feminist ethics of care towards what kinds of masculinities we can cultivate and would do a service to all people to have more of. So thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, unfortunately, I kind of came to the question of masculinity at the end of my work. And so I don't have much ethnographic research at all, or any really, that's focused on other models of masculinity. It's sort of like a question that emerged as a result of my work, and that then I just saw replicated with the military intervention. So I'm curious if others on the panel or in the audience can speak to that.
Okay, so my response is very much just anecdotal. Thinking about my own family, I was just having a discussion this week with my mother. I have family in Ciudad Juarez. So I think we tend to think, and I think there's a need to discuss this hyper-masculinity, and it's probably the more visible areas of where the change is happening. I think it's harder to gauge the more nuanced and private spaces and how those changes happen, right? And so I was thinking about this, talking to my mother this week, because she was telling me about one of my cousins who worked at a maquiladora for about 10 years, and she has 5 children, and the family always assumed that her husband was pretty much good for nothing because he wasn't working and was not, quote unquote, productive, right? So my mother comes back to me to respond to that and said, well, she's like, I don't see it that way, because the only way she could have gone to work is because he was taking care of the children. And so they've had to restructure their family model, in terms, and pretty much sort of flip the roles. And it doesn't happen, and I can tell you for myself, having grown up with my grandfather who was taking care of me, it's not a simple inversion of roles, right? Because it's not like suddenly the father becomes a mother, right? But it changes the family dynamic in a sense. And I think there's probably a lot more of that happening than we're aware of, right? But it happens in the private space of the home, and it doesn't get the attention probably that the violence does. So I don't know. I was reflecting on that precisely.
You made me think of a book called The Meanings of Macho by Matthew Gutman, who writes a bit about these other masculinities. So you might refer to that book. And then I thought, well, maybe I have an anecdotal thing to add as well, and I would say Juan Gabriel. Who knows Juan Gabriel here? He's in concert in Houston on Sunday, and I'm going. It's been like what I've been looking forward to for a while. I'm not going to attempt to do a kind of cultural studies interpretation or reading of that. This is purely as a musical fan, but I find very interesting that Juarez is so identified with Juan Gabriel, men and women. And Juan Gabriel, if you think about it, is kind of like the epitome of alterity, right? He's a son of migrants from Michoacan. He's an orphan, or they call him an orphan. His mother was still alive, but put him in an orphanage to work for a wealthy man on Avenida Juarez. He's, we presume he's gay. He hasn't come out, but we do. And I think his songs, I've always loved his music because the emotions, the emotionality, and the sentiments that he expresses in his lyrics are very different to me and far more sophisticated than the kind of poetry I love from, songwriters like Jose Alfredo Jimenez and et cetera. And I think it's really interesting that Juarez embraces Juan Gabriel at the same time then responds in all these ways, right? But in a problematic way, but still embraces the person that stands for other. It's like the border is other. So anyway, that's purely anecdotal.
I am in cultural studies, and I think it's an important case to really consider. He's the pride of Ciudad Juarez, right? And he's also the pride of Mexico in terms of culture and what it represents. And so it's not a minor thing, right? And he's not openly gay, but he's openly effeminate and embraces, his sexuality very openly, and it's accepted, right? And so I think that's important, right? I think it's a great example. So
we have this ongoing vote between a group of journalist friends and me, and like this whole thing of Vicente Fernandez or Juan Gabriel, and there's a camp of us that's Juan Gabriel, and every year he still ends up winning. And so we say it's kind of like a measure of sort of the times, right? And we love Chente, but it's like Chente is a model of that machismo that we talked about, Juan Gabriel, a model of something very different. It's like, where are we going to fall?
Well, and it's also the regionalism, right?
And Mexico region is everything, yeah. Border or like periphery or center, basically.
Yeah.
Heartland or periphery.
Hi, thank you all for opening up this to the public. I'm a member of the community. I'm not a student here, and I really benefited from hearing your views on this. Now, my question to all of you is, we're talking about this cycle of violence and capitalism and militarization that are sort of intractable themes that we have to deal with. I don't see them going away anytime soon. So what does prevention look like? How do we get young boys early on to sort of create safe spaces for them to redefine masculinity and Mexican masculinity in particular? Like, what does that look like in your view?
That would be solving world problems, right? So the official poverty in Mexico is at 52%. and that's official, right? Addressing that would be getting at the problem, but how do you get there? And that's the question. If we had simple solutions, we wouldn't be here, I think, right? So I don't know.
Well, and you can't fix that problem with capitalism still in place, so.
I mean, I think the problem is so much bigger, so much bigger to be able to find a solution at this moment. I think in general, for problems having to do with masculinity, like one of the many places to start is kind of in the home. Like if parents aren't like gender bullying their children, then that helps a lot. But of course they're going to learn other things in the world. I'm sorry, I don't have a solution for that huge problem.
I believe, and there is no answer at this point. And the question you ask is fair. Give me a concrete. The concrete is unfortunately small and in many ways individual and gets shut down. Your example of the university trying to do a concrete. Here's a fence. We're putting flowers on it. We're going to make it so it's nice, and the government shuts that down. In many ways, those are the answers. The answers are looking for something different, encouraging that we not solidify gendered identities. And one of the ways I do that is I always ask, when a baby is born, are you going to pierce their ears? And I ask that if they're a boy. And just to get them to think about that, and I go, why do we pierce the ears of little girls? Well, it's real simple. So we can tell the difference and start treating them differently. And that's, that's kind of stuff we're looking at in terms of how to address masculinity and femininity as a hardened gendered identity. Is we are already bucking up against systems that work very hard to reproduce themselves and don't like it when you mess with them. But your job is to mess with them. That's our job. No matter what it is, we're going to mess with them. And so as guns come on our campus, our job is to mess with that. Just like kids at UT. We decide, okay, campus carry, dildo carry. Well, let's find stuff like that. That's the response. It's simple, it's narrow, and unfortunately, in many ways, it's unsatisfactory because it is so small compared to the large. But in many ways, that is the start. And my real answer, though, is activism, whatever form it takes. No student, no faculty member, no staff member, in my opinion, should just be those things. I'm an activist faculty member. My students are activists. My colleagues, the staff members in my department are activists. They find what it is that they want to participate in to make it different.
I have a I'm sorry.
Just quickly, I don't have any brothers or any children, so males are really confounding to me. I can't answer that directly.
No, they're very confusing.
But I would say just two things that came to mind. One is that we see in Juarez that a lot of the young men who are vulnerable are young men who don't have social systems and structures that they're a part of. So I think that's key. I think they seem to always be seeking affiliation and support. And the other thing I'd say is at the level of affect and emotions, and I wanted to include the perspective of the males in this family that I wrote about. They'd lost a sister. I could never talk to the males. I could talk to the women, and that was difficult because they were in a lot of grief. But the young men, when I tried to broach it, or when I just asked politely, they just smiled shyly, and I could tell it was a no, and their eyes filled with tears. And it's like they weren't allowed in any way to speak. They couldn't put words to what they were feeling. And you will hear some mothers in Juarez, like the mothers go out and become activists when they lose a daughter, and the men go silent. There were a few exceptions. And you heard stories from women who would say that a father or two died, and they'd say they died of their sadness, you know. So I'd say sort of the issue of both of providing affect and a space and a language with which to express the inner self.
I have a question. I know we've talked a little bit about queerness and how that can sometimes be used to push back against the gender binary and traditional norms of masculinity and femininity within this context, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the recent trend of pinkwashing that's been occurring. So you have all of this violence, capitalism is having this horrible destructive effect on the economy and on poor and working class people. And yet you have the government being patted on the back for approving marriage equality. In Mexico specifically. I mean, you can apply this to the States, but that's kind of a different animal. My question is, how can we respond to this, basically? I mean, what do you have to say about this?
You know, you're right about the pink washing. Israel consistently gets pink washed. They're less heterosexist in some societies. The thing, as Foucault points out, the thing about power is that it's insidious. And what it does most efficiently is make everything culpable, take everything in, and domesticate it for its own use. And when that happens, I really appreciate the fact that people point it out. Okay, that's great. Glad to hear that. What about this, this, and this? Or you're not going to answer this, this, and this because you want to talk about this? Okay, great. But we still have this. And, you know, pinkwashing continues. At the same time, though, you know, the fluidity of gender is threatening to some structures because it's going to be different. And so there is very much resistance to the fluidity. So it's a two-edged sword in some ways. I encourage the fluidity of gender. I also recognize how some girls demand pink. Okay, fine. But
Boys should also demand pink and non-binary children.
that's right. And, you know, it's very frightening to hear that males are not allowed to be emotional. They're only allowed to be violent. That's the scary cycle that we're talking about here. What is the response? What do we tell a male if his sister is murdered? We tell him to go murder the guy? No. Maybe the response should be, let's seek help and trauma support for everyone, including the men. Let them tell their stories as well. That's the real question I ask. That's the real gender bender. Women should be allowed to get angry, right? Okay, well, maybe a mother should go out and beat somebody up. But the father should be allowed to cry and be sad and tell his story of woe as well.
Interject really quickly. I was thinking about some random news story that I saw about Colombia. that they were making paramilitary with guerrillas take yoga together.
What?
Yeah, as a peace, kind of finding ways of dealing with frustrations and tension. So, I mean, they thought it was working. I mean, but I don't know if you would make a whole country do yoga on a grand scale. I don't know. But it's interesting, how do you deal with violence in a nonviolent sort of way, right? And how do you deal with the trauma? So it's I don't know. It's just something to throw out there.
Hello? Okay. I apologize. I'm usually never this verbose, but after the presentations by Professor Gonzalez and Sisk and Luna, it got me thinking about other comparisons. And then with a person that asked that very profound question about a solution from the community. I wish she were still here, but when she asked that, it got me thinking about some comparable cases, which I'm going to go out on a limb here. But what you were talking about with respect to some of the patterns that you saw in your research, for instance, we've already talked about, this border area becoming very demographically overwhelmed in the last couple of generations, industrialization, maquilas, the lack of opportunity, employment, the lack of a marriage partner, in other words, where their masculinity would usually be identified with, right, that they're supporting their family. So you have all of these patterns you've identified, Dr. Vai, and then I sort of hear her question about a solution, and it struck me that the question that she was asking was the same kinds of questions, for instance, you hear with Middle Eastern commentators when they speak of, for instance, the solution to suicide bombers, which are always men, disproportionately men. I shouldn't say always men, but disproportionately men with some similar profiles, similar conditions you're talking about. About 2 months ago, the science writer Malcolm Gladwell posited the same question that this person posited about a solution, but to the mass school shootings, which you got me thinking about this, Professor Gonzalez, about those mass school shootings, which are always disproportionately young men. I've been curious enough and sick enough to read some of their manifestos. In many cases, they talk about the lack of meeting girls, or that guy that was from LA Fitness that shot up the place because he was rejected, et cetera, ad nauseum. So, it was just a comment to sort of say that although I agree with the commentary about some of the gender questions, it seems like we're talking about as precisely what you said, Dr. Vai, which is a particular historical moment, which you have all of these huge factors coming together, and they're manifesting themselves in different spots, of which your research has given us some incredible insight into the border area. But we see the same phenomenon, it seems, taking place across the board. I don't have a question, I apologize, but your research and the panel made me think about some of these comparisons.
Something really quick, and maybe part of the issue is that it's hard to know what a solution is, because it's not like we're trying to rewind time to get to a point. We're trying to get to a future that it should look very different from the past, right?
That's exactly what you said, Professor. We're not going to solve real problems in this panel.
Yeah.
And maybe the question isn't even so much about a solution as to agency, right? How can we exert, what kind of agency can I exert over my life, over my situation, over the men and women I know?
Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Congratulations, Sarah. That was impressive.